everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Daphne Watkins, and I'm a professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work and the director of the Vivian A. and James L. Curtis Center for Health Equity Research and Training at the University of Michigan. Today, we will hear a presentation from visiting Fulbright Senior Scholar, Professor James Smith. But before we do, I want to share with you the Curtis Center vision, mission, and of course, a few housekeeping matters related to this webinar. So first, our vision at the Curtis Center is health equity for marginalized communities in Michigan and across the globe. And our mission is to stimulate research, training, and outreach opportunities that promote health equity by supporting work that deepens our understanding of the factors that lead to inequities and the strategies that eliminate them. However, as director of the Curtis Center, I do feel a sense of responsibility to note that while we will hear from an international scholar today about young men in Northern Australia, I want to underscore the fact that we also remain mindful and prayerful about matters that are happening right here in the United States. So my desire is for all of you to practice self-compassion and do whatever it is you need to do to take care of yourselves and each other. Now for a few housekeeping matters. You will see that your Zoom meeting interface should have both a chat and a Q&A feature. And note that any content that you enter into the chat feature today is going to be seen by the meeting host only and not by the participants. Now also, if you have any questions at any time during Professor Smith's presentation, feel free to enter them into the Q&A box throughout the presentation, and we'll make sure that he addresses them at the end of the presentation today. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our speaker for today. Professor James Smith is currently a visiting Fulbright Senior Scholar at the Vivian A. and James L. Curtis Center for Health Equity Research and Training at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. His Fulbright project involves synthesizing the global evidence about health promotion strategies that aim to reduce health inequities among young men of color. In Australia, he holds the position of Father Frank Flynn Fellow and head of the Alcohol, Other Drugs, and Gambling team at Menzies School of Health Research based in the Northern Territory. He has more than 20 years of experience working in fields related to men's health, health promotion, health equity, evaluation, and Indigenous affairs. He is also doing applied public health research that influences positive change within the communities that he works. He is a fellow of the Australian Health Promotion Association and editor-in-chief of Health Promotion Journal of Australia. So please join me in welcoming Dr. James Smith.
Thank you very much, Daphne. And I'm just sharing my screen at the moment.
Great.
Excellent. Hopefully people can see the screen.
Yes, you can see it.
So thanks very much for the lovely introduction and for the invitation to speak as part of the Curtis Center for Health Equity Research and Training. I would also like to thank all the participants online for joining us today, despite COVID-19 and the chaos that that's caused, not just here in the US, but globally. To start off the presentation, I'd first like to acknowledge the power and privilege that I experience as a white male, and I want to reaffirm my commitment to standing with all people of colour to address the inequities that they face on a daily basis, none more so than we've seen over the last few days and in fact weeks, months, years. Second, as Daphne mentioned, the focus of my Fulbright project has been to synthesise the health promotion evidence base about health promotion strategies aimed at reducing health inequities among boys and young men of colour. I remain more convinced now more than ever that this is a critical focus, that there needs to be urgent action in this space, and that needs to be supported by systemic and structural change to promote equity for boys and young men of colour. Now, third, while today's presentation is about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males back in Australia, they face many of the same health and social inequities experienced by boys and young men of colour in the US. the synergies are stark. So, but I guess what I'm hoping that today's presentation can show is that we can actually have a different narrative, one that's very positive and strengths-based, and that can change some of those more negative popular and media narratives that we see on a daily basis. To start off with, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan, named for Michigan, the world's largest freshwater system and located in the Huron River watershed, was formed and has grown through connections with the land stewarded by the Nishui, Ishkadawan, Anishinaabeg, the Three Fires people, who are the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, along with their neighbours, the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandot nations. I apologise if my terminology is not quite correct, but certainly I'm very genuine in the acknowledgement to respect the Indigenous people of the Michigan area. I'd also like to dedicate today's presentation to my family, to my wife Brooke and my 4 kids, Cameron, April, Jacob and Pippa. They've travelled with me to the US as part of the Fulbright. This photo here is from part of our travels before the Fulbright commenced in the Great Smoky Mountains. And we've been locked up together, as have many other people from across the US for most of my Fulbright duration here in Ann Arbor. So I really do want to say thank you to them for putting up with me and listening to all the shh and stuff that I've said while I've been engaging in the research while I've been here. In terms of the presentation overview today, I'll talk a little bit around men's health, a little bit about what we know about Aboriginal male health, talk about why we should be focusing on particularly young Aboriginal males. Then I'll draw on some of the research that we've done on a project around understanding health literacy among young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males in the top end of the Northern Territory, Australia. I'll talk about some of the thematic analysis that we've done, and I'll also talk about some of the key learnings and how they relate to work here in the US. So what do we know about men's health? Well, we know globally that men have more power and privilege than women. We can't ignore that is the case. But what we also know is that men commonly have shorter life expectancy and higher rates of premature mortality than women, particularly for preventative health concerns. We also know that men's adoption of risky health practices and perceived reluctance to seek help and engage in preventative health behaviours is perceived to be problematic. I'm not saying that that's certainly not apportioning individual blame in regard to that. There are a whole range of social determinants of health that underpin those health practices, and I'll be talking about some of those shortly. But we also know that these practices are disproportionately noted among marginalised and adolescent young men, and particularly boys and young men of colour. So what do we know about Aboriginal male health? Well, we know that there's challenges associated with help seeking and health service use. And I say challenges there because it's not, again, just these young men in terms of their individual behaviours, but it's also the environments, the settings in which they're engaging with. We know that they have poor mental health and high rates of suicide and suicidality, and that's very similar to what we see here in the US with boys and young men of colour. And we know that they have poorer educational outcomes across the spectrum. That includes low levels of participation, achievement and completion across the education system. It includes high levels of disengagement and suspension. And unfortunately, some of that suspension goes right back to the early years, and low levels of post-secondary education and career aspiration. We also, as I mentioned before, know that there's this engagement with social determinants of health. We know that they have high rates of incarceration. We know that they have challenges accessing and retaining safe and secure housing, and that many are homeless. We know that they're overrepresented in the child welfare system, and that has lifelong implications. We know that they have poor job attainment and retention and high rates of unemployment. And we know that all of that is underpinned by experience of intergenerational trauma and racism. And we know that notions of healing are absolutely critical to addressing all of those issues. So whilst this is a particularly grim picture, what I'm going to do is focus on, I guess, the strengths-based approach that we've taken. But before I do that, I also want to talk about how does gender and or masculinities fit in with this discussion around Aboriginal male health in Australia. Firstly, theoretical conceptions of masculinity and or masculinities have emerged out of a Western tradition. So we've got to understand that that conceptualizations of gender have come from a different place that hasn't been stemmed from a sort of cultural basis. Certainly not initially in the way that it's been applied within an academic context up until recently. We also know that gender is a very fluid concept and that notions of gender and identity can change over time and change at different junctures throughout the life course. We know that there's very strong academic narratives around changing and challenging gender norms, particularly those that have a negative overtone. We've certainly seen a lot in social media around hyper toxic and hegemonic forms of masculinity and the damage that they can do in terms of health and well-being, not just for men, but for their partners, their families, and the communities in which they live. We also know that colonialism has and continues to impact Indigenous male identities. And we also know that there's some emerging scholarship about Indigenous masculinities that's tied to, I guess, cultural beliefs and systems, and within the context of this work, particularly connection to country and intergenerational exchange of information. Also, in terms of Aboriginal male health in Australia, this isn't a new concept to address these issues. There's been some, I guess, policy traction for the last 16 years or so in this space. We've got a national framework for improving the health and wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males that was released in 2004. We then had one of the first national male health policies in the world. We're one of 5 nations that have them. At present, the US doesn't have one, but it'd be great to see some work in this space. And we've also seen that the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation within Australia has also led its own strategy development around men's Aboriginal male health from 2013 to 2030. And that has a very strong social determinants and cultural determinants of health focus to it. Sorry, wrong way. In terms of the National Men's Health Strategy, so this has been re-released. This is our second iteration of the policy, if you like, which has a 10-year focus to it. And there's a specific focus on health literacy and addressing structural and systemic barriers to good health. And that's really what this particular project is about. But I think something important to mention is that back in 2016, we ran an Indigenous male research strategy think tank within the Northern Territory. And this was to identify research priorities within our state-based or territory context. So it was around what was important to Indigenous males within the Northern Territory. And this list that you see here is indicative of some of the things that were mentioned. This project sits at the nexus of multiple things. So I guess what I'm saying here is that this project was born out of community identified priorities, and that for me and the work I do is a really important part of advancing the Indigenous male health space in Australia. So on with a bit of a discussion around the project. As I mentioned, it's health literacy among young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males in the top end of the Northern Territory, and I'll show a map in a moment. It was funded through a special funding round by the Lowitja Institute, which was around valuing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young men. We've just had a paper accepted for publication in the American Journal of Men's Health, which should be released later in the year, so keep a watch out for that. But in the interim, the report that we produced back in the middle of last year is available via that web link. This project involved a large research team, considering the size of the project itself, which was quite small. It included 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander male scholars and 5 non-Indigenous scholars. Between us, we've got experience in Aboriginal male health, in work around gender and masculinities and health, and or health literacy. So I would like to acknowledge Uncle and Dr. Mick Adams, Jason Bonson, Barry Judd, Jesse Flay, David Annadson, all on the top line there, and Richard Osborne, Murray Drummond, Anthony Molino and Ben Christie as well. It's been very much a collaborative process between Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers, and that's been really important to the outcomes of this research. A little bit more around understanding context. You'll see that map of Australia down in the corner there, and then the Northern Territory map as well. So the Northern Territory is sort of that large chunk within the northern part of in the middle of the northern part of Australia. This research has occurred across the Darwin, Palmerston, Nhulunbuy and Katherine regions, and we call that the top end of the NT. But to give some additional context, that's a really large landmass, and it only has a population of around 235,000 people, and 30% of that population is Indigenous. It's very geographically dispersed, other than Darwin, which has a population of about 120,000, and those other ones up the centre there, Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Katherine. It's really made up of many remote and very remote communities, ranging from 5,000 people being the largest, down to less than 100 in some communities. It's because of the large geographical distance, it takes approximately 2 hours to fly from Darwin to Alice Springs, to give some idea. The Northern Territory is located in both tropical and desert climates. So we've got cyclones at one end and hot, dry desert in the other. The Indigenous health and social outcomes are akin to those in developing world contexts, and as I mentioned earlier, not indifferent to what we face with boys and young men of colour here in the US. And I also wanted to emphasise that the Northern Territory, I think a really important thing is that they've got a very strong connection to culture and Aboriginal community control in the way that they go about their work. So there's a real strong sense of cultural identity within many of those remote and very remote communities, and in fact the urban communities as well. This gives you a bit more context. Again, the Northern Territory there overlaid across the top of Alaska and Australia over the top of the US, just to give you a feel of how large that geographical landmass is for such a small population. I won't go into the aims and objectives in too much detail, other than to say that it's really sitting at that nexus between health literacy, gender, cultural identity with an overlay of age, because they're young Aboriginal males. For those that aren't familiar with intersectionality as a framework, intersectionality is generally defined as an analytic and theoretical approach that considers the meaning and consequences of socially defined constructs, such as age, race and gender. So it's looking at those intersections between them. I think it's important that I mention that this theoretical approach emanated out of Black feminist scholarship here in the US. So I acknowledge that. I think within the context of this, and what's been really interesting, is that intersectionality is an approach that's been used consistently within men's health equity spaces, and increasingly so as well. I just wanted to mention briefly that I will tend to be using the term males rather than men, and that has a cultural connotation within the context of this work, and the details are there, but really this is about adolescent males and young adult males. In terms of the methodology, it had 3 parts to it. There was a quantitative component, surveys. I'm not going to go into that in a lot of detail today. Essentially, we didn't get a survey response that allows us the ability to be able to present publicly, but I will be talking about the qualitative components, which included yarning sessions, and that was underpinned by conversational health literacy assessment tool, chat. And also what I'll call a hybrid photo voice. It isn't actually photo voice. It doesn't follow the same process, but it's really around using Facebook posts from these young Aboriginal males and looking at those retrospectively. And we had consent to do individual consent to do that from each of those young males, and I'll talk a little bit around that. And we did receive ethics approval from the Charles Darwin University Human Research Ethics Committee. The focus is Aboriginal males aged 14 to 25 years. And in terms of the yarning sessions, there were 9 yarning sessions across those three regions that I mentioned earlier. And they were across 3 very different settings. So we had a flexible learning and education centre that was targeted towards students at risk of falling out of the education system. We had an academy that was attached to a sporting club around trying to improve their engagement in rugby in that instance. We interviewed had a yarning session with some young males in an alcohol rehabilitation centre, an employment program, a couple of other sporting programs attached to schools, but also a youth drop-in. So some quite diverse settings. And in terms of the photo voice component, we had originally planned on issuing iPads to the young men to take photos of what was important to them around their health and well-being. But what we actually found was that there was a large pool of data that was already there available through their Facebook feeds. So we got, as I mentioned before, informed consent to access those Facebook feeds retrospectively, and we've analysed that data and triangulated that against the information presented in the yarning sessions, and that's what I'll be presenting. So all of the photos that you see from now on in have been reflected in that Facebook component. So they've all been drawn off their Facebook feeds. There were 5 overarching themes that emerged out of both the yarning session data and the Facebook data. One is around Western concepts of health, another one around cultural concepts of health. There was a lot of discussion around social determinants of health, lots of discussion around family, the importance of family and what that holds, both at an individual level, but also from a cultural perspective, and also friends and mates and the roles that they play. And I'll talk to each of those issues now. In terms of Western concepts of health, what we found is that that was discussed in a very dualistic way. There was discussion around physical aspects of health, and there was discussion around mental health. We were quite surprised as a research team around the amount of discussion that there was around mental health, and not just in terms of the pathologising of depression and anxiety, but other concepts that had more of a strengths-based focus to them. It's achievement, aspirations, celebration, recognition, praise, role modelling, and social support. So those things were really important in the way that they talked about their health. These are a couple of examples of what they were posting in relation to their health. And a few examples from the qualitative work, and I'll read this out verbatim. Dudes are meant to be tough as nails, not give a shit about anything, and girls are sensitive. You're always told to harden up when you cry from fatherly figures like your dad or your pop. He'd always tell you to man up or something like that. So you can see there that there's some undertones of hegemonic constructions of masculinity there, but I want to emphasise that that's not the only narratives that we heard. We heard narratives that that sort of kick up against some of those traditional notions of masculinity as well, and you'll see those as we move through. In terms of cultural concepts of health, we heard a lot around being on country, fishing and hunting, activities that are culturally bound. We also heard terms that are very culturally significant as well, notions of staying strong, and that's not staying strong in terms of one's physical self. That's staying strong in a much more holistic sense, mentally, spiritually, etc. Doing things right way is very much tied to cultural law, LORE, as is discipline. They're actually concepts that are really hard to describe within an English narrative. So they're culturally bound context, and I think that's an important point to make. We also heard about bush foods, bush medicine, cultural identity. There was a little bit of discussion around intergenerational trauma, but there was probably more discussion around respect for elders. But with that discussion around respect for elders, there was also some disheartening discussion around either the lack of support from, or perceived lack of support from elders. There was also some discussion around the fact that elders that they had looked up to weren't around anymore, that they had passed on before their time. And this is a real problem for these young men, yet re-emphasises the importance of intergenerational exchange of information, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. The other thing that came up, particularly within the Facebook data, was notions of sovereignty, particularly reflected through images of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, or the Aboriginal flag, but sometimes the Aboriginal, sometimes the Torres Strait Islander flag as well. But the Aboriginal flag was very dominant as an expression of cultural identity. Here are a few more examples that sort of resonate with that. And as a follow-up, as I mentioned before, that term right way has cultural connotations, and to try and put that into context, I'll give one example here. Bringing them up the right way. Nowadays, culture is pretty important to have them around. I think it's important to watch them grow positive. I've seen it growing up with a couple of my cousins. They went downhill, but then their parents have to, you know, pull their heads in off the rails. They grow up quickly, but for your own thing, I reckon it's the right way to bring them up. There was this third theme around social determinants of health as well. Again, lots of discussion around employment, jobs and careers, about school and education, around detention, jail, incarceration, housing, accommodation, racism, and community and civic participation. The community and civic participation was tied very much to those that were involved in formalised or organised activities, particularly sporting clubs. I think of the young men that we interviewed from the Alcohol Rehabilitation Centre I mentioned earlier, they'd transitioned out of detention into that, and they all expressed that jail or incarceration was something that they expected in their life. It was very disheartening to hear that that was a normal part of what they expected their life to be, and I certainly hope that this research can help to change that over the longer term. In terms of the social determinants of health, this particular participant, I won't read that out verbatim, but he was reflecting on a job opportunity at the local level as a ranger that was tied to his culture and that helped tourism in the region and that could provide an income for him and his family. Family, as I mentioned before, and as the title of the presentation suggests, is exceptionally important. And I really love this photo here, Endless Love for My Baby Bro. We had multiple examples of these young Aboriginal males posting examples on their Facebook feeds around their parents, their grandparents, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles, and the love and respect that they had for them. There was also a very strong narrative around fatherhood and parenting, and that's something that we weren't necessarily expecting. That was perhaps our own fault. We didn't really think about the fact that many of these 18, 19 and 20-year-old males that we would be having yarning sessions with and looking at their Facebook feeds were in fact fathers already. So not surprisingly, we had a lot of dialogue around fathers and fathering and parenting and what that meant to them. We also found that those that were fathers were talking about social determinants of health, employment, education, incarceration, housing, much more frequently than the younger fellas. With the younger fellas, what we found is that they had aspirations to be fathers. So even some of those younger 14, 15, 16-year-old males were still talking about becoming a father, and that was important to them in terms of the context of their family. As this participant sums up quite nicely, mum, dad and siblings, family are really important. They are our personal connections. If I'm feeling sad or something, my dad mostly, because I tell him everything that happens, he helped me eat my vegetables. He'll say, stop being lazy, get up and do something, get some exercise, go for a walk or go fishing. And the last one is friends and mates. And what we found is that they were extremely important. They were confidants and they used them for help seeking. They had people that they trusted. However, there were some of, again, those hegemonic masculinity traits that were noted there as well in terms of risk-taking and particularly adventure sports. There was also lots of fun and humour in the way that they spoke about their mates and friendship. And as you can see, there were lots of photos as well on their Facebook feeds that were group oriented with their mates, friends, and particularly sporting teams. And as one young fellow reflected, school, I just get to come to school to try to get myself a job, license, and to see my friends. I come to school to see my friends. Most positive ways, some negative. Sometimes you're stressed out, mad, angry. You just need to go to check your friends out and calm down. So what are some of the key learnings from all of this? Well, what we've found is that young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males conceptualise and negotiate health from both Western and cultural paradigms. It's not one or the other. It's a really complex cultural interface that they're navigating. So it's not an easy journey for them. We also find that the nexus between the social construction of gender and culture is very complex interrelationship, and again, it extends beyond a Western Indigenous binary. So we've got to start understanding that it is much more fluid when we start to think about gender and culture in context. We also know that young Aboriginal males resist and embrace hegemonic constructions of masculinity, and sometimes simultaneously. I'll give you an example. So one of the young fellas spoke about the importance of going out hunting on country and being able to provide for his family to get a nourishing meal. So within that, there's notions of breadwinner. There's notions of independence. There's also notions, though, of country, of hunting, of cultural activities, etc. So we've got to try and play with that and understand what that means for these young men. We also found that there were these alternative constructions of masculinity, and that gender is a highly fluid concept. And that perhaps has some potential in terms of gender transformative approaches. So these notions of changing gender norms or challenging gender norms. We also found that there was strong alignment with some of the emerging scholarship around Indigenous masculinities, specifically that relating to connection to country, but also the intergenerational exchange of information. And I know some of the work of Lisa Wexler, based at University of Michigan in the School of Social Work, and her work with Laskin communities has done work in that space. We also heard very clearly that celebrating positive achievements was important to this cohort. And I guess that shows that we've got this opportunity to really change the narrative and to think from a much more strengths-based position that counters that really negative stereotypes that we see within public and social media all too often. And to compare that with some of the US scholarship around boys and young men of colour, what I've found is particularly recent scholarship over the last 5 to 10 years has had that strength-based narrative embedded within it. It uses terms like improvements, solution, aim higher, achievement, engage, protective effects, and promise in the way that work with boys and young men of colour is currently being conceptualised. And I think that's something that we can learn from within the Australian context in further work that we do in this space. I've already mentioned that social determinants became more important as these young men moved into young adulthood. What that emphasises is that life course approaches are really, really important within the context of work with Aboriginal, young Aboriginal males. And as I mentioned, we also know that family and friends are really critical in the way that these young Aboriginal males talk and conceptualise their health and well-being. Yet most of the health promotion interventions within the Australian context at the moment are very individually focused. They're focused on individual behaviour change, and when they do occur in group situations, it's still around those individual behaviours. It's not sort of conceptualised in terms of from a more communal perspective. So what we think is that actually family and peer-oriented interventions should be prioritised in terms of health promotion work with these young males. And again, there's some interesting examples that are starting to emerge from the US context where particularly peer interventions are starting to work. We also know that outreach efforts are really important, and that settings-based approaches are more likely to work with this group. They were very clear that whilst they knew that health services existed, that they didn't feel that they really met their needs, and that they much preferred health service providers and health professionals to meet them on their terms. From a research perspective, we found that working in partnership with organisations that already had existing relationships with young Aboriginal males was really critical, and it's certainly something that we're looking to do in future work in this space. From a I guess that photo voice, or at least the social media aspect of the work, we think that alternative and emerging visually oriented research methods, particularly those using social media such as Facebook, but it could also include Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, etc., that they can be really useful for collecting and triangulating data to give a much better and deeper understanding of what's important to the lives of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males. We also think that some of the learnings from using Facebook or social media through this research can actually help to inform novel online health promotion design and delivery. And I think that the work that Daphne and her team are doing in the Curtis Centre through the Why Being Men project is a great example of how social media can be embraced to provide education and support to boys and young men of colour. And I think that's something that we could certainly be doing better within the Australian context. The other thing which is interesting, and this was many of our Indigenous researchers mentioned this, is that they felt having young research assistants involved in the project, in the yarning sessions in particular, was really important, and in some respects was more important than having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males running that. Ideally, you would have a young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander male, but they did feel that Ben, our non-Indigenous research assistant, being of closer age to these young fellas, provided new opportunities to engage and talk with those young males on their terms. That's all from me. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Daphne and her team and the Curtis Centre for Health Equity Research and Training at the School of Social Work. Whilst I have been at home most of my time in Ann Arbor, it's been great to engage with you all in different ways while I have been here. I'd like to thank the Australian American Fulbright Commission for supporting me to be here in the US as part of the Fulbright project, the Centre for Research in Men's Health at Vanderbilt University, where I spent a couple of weeks before I came to University of Michigan, the Witcher Institute, who funded the research, and of course all the research participants, the voices of those young Aboriginal males that allow me to share this story. So thank you, and I'd love to open it up to questions. Thanks.
Hi, James. The questions are rolling in, so how about we just begin? Sound good?
Go for it.
Okay, so the first one came through a little earlier in your presentation, and this is Shanna Katari, Professor Katari here in the School of Social Work, wanted to know if you could define yarning sessions. So she says this is a new language for her, so she's really interested in learning. What does it mean? What are yarning sessions exactly?
Yeah, so yarning sessions is something that's come up in Indigenous scholarship. It's considered to be a decolonising or Indigenous research approach. And it's a much more open-ended format than, say, focus groups that tend to have more of a semi-structured, or they don't always have a semi-structured format, but are a little bit more contrived. And yarning sessions, so they're just more relaxed in their approach and more free-flowing and more culturally respectful. So they don't necessarily happen in a formal environment. It might be sitting out under a tree. It might be in a whole range of different contexts that fit the population that you're having a yarn or an exchange with. Hopefully that understands things. But there's certainly some Indigenous scholarship, and I'm happy to forward some papers around yarning.
Sure. So Shanna, you'll have to let us know if you want to follow up with that. We had another question come through from Dylan. The question is, to the point you just made about utilizing social media to engage young males in Australia in conversations about health and mental health, have there been any developments in this kind of outreach during the time of COVID?
Yeah, I don't know that there's been any developments per se, but there's certainly been a lot more discussion about it. I think COVID and the notion of a pandemic and the notion of self-isolating and what that's meant for education in particular has meant that we're thinking really differently around what that entails. Yeah. I know from some work that I've been doing with the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education back in Australia, that in one of their webinars that they had the other week with the equity practitioners, it was identified that the social and emotional well-being of higher education students or university students from equity groups, particularly Indigenous students, was a huge concern, and that they didn't have the skills to be able to engage or know what to do. So I think that we've got to start to bring that together, to start to look at, well, what are some of the things that we know that we can do to support, young males from equity backgrounds, and how can we start to look at that interface with social media. And to be quite frank, probably the best work in that space at the moment is the work that Daphne and her team are leading at the moment. That's why I'm here in the US, to learn from them and to find out how they're going about that work. So it's new terrain, but we know that much more needs to be done, and that COVID can provide that opportunity, that mechanism to be actually doing more work in that space.
Mm-hmm. And so we had another question come in that I think is probably a second part to what you just said. So this is a question from Najaya Mention, who's saying, excellent presentation, James. I'm wondering how the Aboriginal community you're working with and or your team have developed interventions, or are in the process of making plans to develop interventions using these findings. So maybe what Najaya is wanting to hear, or maybe what are your next steps in this with regard to translating this to programs?
Excellent question. We've just received advice that we've got funding from the Australian government to develop some online modules that will relate to the findings from this research. And we're going to work closely with a local Indigenous men's organisation in Darwin to be able to develop that content up. So it's early days. In fact, the contract is still being negotiated at the moment, so I should probably be a little bit quiet, but it's really exciting that it doesn't stop with the findings itself, right, that there is an action orientation. And again, those young fellas said that was really important to them, that this is fine, but we actually want stuff to support us in a much more operational, practical way. So we've listened to that. The funding we've got is minuscule, and we know that we need much more. And I don't think that's indifferent to what I've seen in the US, is that there's those that are working in practice contexts really struggling to find sustainable funding to do the amazing work that they're doing with boys and young men of colour. So whether it be online interventions, whether it be face-to-face interventions, we've got to deal with the fact that we need to see more investment. We need to see a stronger policy focus around boys and young men of colour. And that has ebbed and flowed in both the US and Australia over time. But we need to see greater investment to be able to do important intervention work of this nature.
Right. Excellent. So a few more questions are starting to roll in now. One from Jamie Abelson is, would you tell us more about the Australian policies regarding Aboriginal health, such as the national framework? And then she puts in parentheses, that might serve as a role model for something that we could develop here in the US. So can you tell us a little bit more about that national framework?
Yeah, so there's two components to that, I guess. One is the men's health story, and one is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander story. From the men's health story, we have had a very strong advocacy base in terms of men's health over 2 decades within Australia. So there was always a lot of pressure on government to develop up a national men's health strategy. So we're in our second iteration. We had one in 2010 that went to 2020, and we've got another one from 2023 to 2030 now. Mm-hmm. The first one had a really strong social determinants of health focus, which was great, but there wasn't a lot of investment wrapped around it. The second strategy has probably more of a behavioural focus to it, and we're yet to see whether there's the level of investment to be able to implement what's in there. But it was one of probably 5, and there's quite a bit written on the development of national men's health strategies and implementation, particularly from the Australian and island contexts. In terms of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health policy setting, that's a different story. There's been lots of action over a very long time that's been very much focused on self-determination, community control, and that continues to be the case. what that means is that there is a separate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health implementation or health plan, and accompanying that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health implementation plan that has been developed in consultation and by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And the Australian government, a lot of their investments in this space are wrapped around that. There are also some other Indigenous specific strategies that have been developed, particularly in relation to social and emotional wellbeing, which are sort of wrapped in under that broader health plan. And again, that has a long trajectory to it as well. I think that's a 10-year plan as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. So we have a couple of questions specifically about the elders. And so I'm going to actually insert a question of my own here before we get to the ones that I'm looking at now. So I remember you mentioning the importance of the intergenerational piece with the Aboriginal males that you're working with. And I'm thinking back to some of my earlier projects dealing with older adult African-American men. And I remember one of our last questions to them during this sort of intervention and data collection period was, you know, if money were no object, what kind of programs could we bring to you all as older African-American men that could improve your mental health? And interestingly enough, the guys would tell us that they wanted us to take our resources to the younger African-American men. So they said, don't bring me any of your resources. Don't bring me any of your money, your supports. Take it to the younger Black men, because when I was their age, I would have benefited greatly from having folks like you who cared about us, that actually wanted to invest in our health. And so I'm curious to know, are you seeing any similar patterns with, you know, these younger guys who may be talking about their elders, or maybe are you talking to the elders about what kinds of things can be helpful for the younger men? Do you see any of those kind of connections at all?
Absolutely. So we've done a separate project around regional and remote Aboriginal males without the age focus on it, around what's important to them around their health and wellbeing. And they were very clear with that. And that was mainly an older cohort that were involved in that research. And they were very clear that focus on the younger males. And what was interesting, they also said, and focus really young. Don't just think about they acknowledge that their youth, those sitting in sort of that young adulthood space, were neglected and hadn't had a lot of support, but they said reach them early, get them when they're first going to school, get them in their early years and focus on that. But they also did emphasise that they're willing to engage in intergenerational exchange, particularly the exchange of cultural knowledge, and that they felt that had dissipated within the Western world. It was very different from their experience as older men and what they had when they were younger to what they could offer the next generation now. And there was a perceived disinterest among the older men of the younger men. And with the younger males, they felt that their elders were, I guess, a little bit the same, a little bit disinterested, and perhaps at arm's length from what they wanted to learn about their culture as well. So there's certainly a huge opportunity there to bring those two together. And I think there would be a strong willingness from both the younger and older generations to do that.
Yeah, seems like a lot of promise through that as well.
Absolutely.
So here's another question from Yatisha. She says, you spoke of respect for the elders being important. Has there been a breakdown in the role or levels of respect of elders? Are people wanting to go back to days of respect, or has this been maintained despite modern influences?
Excellent question. I think, so the young males in our study expressed the importance of respect. They expressed that they wanted to do that. They didn't necessarily indicate that they were doing that. And I think that there is a bit of a breakdown there. And I think that pull from a Western side, particularly to engage in online and social media platforms that are very different to those that the elders have experienced, is a real divide there. And I think it's about building those relationships and strengthening that notion of respect in ways that it has been there in the past. They certainly understood that respect was a really important principle that underpinned their cultural identity, but they didn't feel there were good mechanisms to support them in conveying that in a practical way in the modern world. So interventions that can really focus in on, I guess, enhancing opportunities to show respect are really important. And I guess that intergenerational exchange that I just spoke about is really important. And that's why I'm really fascinated in the work that Lisa Wexler and her team have been doing in Alaska, because I think there are huge things that we can learn from that work in terms of what's happening within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander context back home.
Yeah, and I think I saw Lisa may have been on for a little while. She might still be on here. But yeah, so listen, this concept of yarning is a popular one. So I think if we were actually in residence, you may have to host one of these sessions for us at some point, right? Because Yatisha had another question about that. She says, can you speak more about the structure? Do you ask questions? Do you address the research questions? Is there any guidance, facilitation from the researcher? So we want to hear more about these yarning sessions and see exactly what's happening in that space.
It's very open-ended. And it's very participant-driven are probably the best ways I can do that. So it's saying, it might be going in and having a conversation. Tell us a bit about your health and well-being. What's important to that? And then it's about sort of snowballing from there in terms of how the conversation develops. But the conversation itself is not necessarily driven by the researchers. It might be driven by the other people that are in that yarning session, talking to each other in the way that unfolds, and in a culturally respectful way as well. So it's almost hard for me to explain what it is and feels like, and it's certainly very hard to explain to an ethics committee or an institutional review board around something that is so vague. But
Sure.
We're really lucky that there's more and more being written about yarning sessions that validates this as an Indigenous research methodology, and it works. You get some really good, deep data from those conversations that you don't get from an individual interview, or that you don't get from a typical focus group that may have more of a structured format. So it's more the lack of structure that's important within a yarning session than having a structure.
Of course. There's something about that freedom that happens, right? Where you don't feel like you're so bound.
That's it.
And so I'm keeping an eye on the clock. And so I'll just take the liberty of asking what may be the last question. So one of the last things you mentioned during your presentation was this idea of engagement. And you mentioned the ages of the research assistants and how big of a difference that makes. What advice do you have for researchers who are listening all across the world right now about, the importance of this community-based participatory research or community-anchored research, and really thinking about how can we do a better job of engaging communities like Aboriginal males or African-American males or Native males, whatever the case may be? What kinds of things should we be doing as researchers to make sure that we're making that connection and truly engaging, and not just being the kinds of researchers who do the helicopter research that we read about and, hate so much, right? So can you give us some advice about true engagement with these kinds of communities?
There's a few things I'd say there. One is, first and foremost, is to value and privilege their voices. Listen to what they have to say. If you don't listen to what the community wants, the research doesn't have purpose. And part of that is recognising that some of the community priorities might not be those that are research priorities. So it's about shifting that and having those community priorities drive what you do, I guess. The other is, for that to be genuine, you need time. So it's good community-based research focused on engagement it's about the relationships. It's all a relational endeavour, and relationships take time. You've got to build that trust and respect to be able to work with those communities. And that goes whether it's young males, older males, other populations. And it's unfortunate that within a research realm, funders are often interested in the middle bit, they're less interested in the engagement that's required up front, and certainly less interested in funding that, and less interested in the knowledge translation aspect at the end. So that's the other bit of that conversation is, I think, once you've done good community-based research, what does that mean? How do you use that to do interventions, to develop resources and tools at the local level, and focusing on that knowledge translation? And the other one is around thinking about it as a capacity building opportunity within the Indigenous context. Notions of self-determination and empowerment are critical. So recognising that it's not just the research team, but it's those community partners, and bringing them along for the journey, supporting them to develop skills that can support good quality research are really important. And that's synonymous with a lot of discussion, global discussion going on around Indigenous data sovereignty at the moment as well, where Indigenous people need to be engaged in all aspects of research, right from the beginning, right to the end. It's not about just engaging us in the fieldwork component, or just engaging us at the start around the engagement bit. It's around all aspects, the analysis, what does that mean, the knowledge translation aspects. So sorry, that was a very long-winded response, but it's something I'm very passionate about. So
no, fantastic. I mean, I think it really highlights the give and the take, and I think we don't often talk about reciprocity as much as we should these days. You know, I think your beginning point about making sure that, you know, we communicate with the people that we want to work with, and we may have our own goals and aspirations, but they may have theirs too, and the two may not be the same. So I just really appreciate that answer. I think reciprocity is the word for the day. You know, what can we give and what can we receive from these communities that we care so much about?
Absolutely. And given that we're coming towards the end, and on that note, it's a perfect juncture in, I've actually got a small gift here for you and the team, Daphne, from one of our remote communities back home. Yeah. And so in the interest of reciprocity, thanks very much for having me at the Curtis Centre over the past 3.5 months. And I look forward to further collaborations and ongoing discussions. So thanks. Thanks heaps.
Likewise. Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone who tuned in today. It was so nice you could take some time out of your schedule to join us. And we will be posting this recording. So for those of you who want to share it with others and want to revisit anything we've talked about, you'll have that opportunity. So with that, I'll say thanks to everyone. Thank you again, Professor James Smith, for a fantastic presentation. And we look forward to seeing everyone soon.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.